Okay, we now move on to a critical and vital aspect of the research we do. We call that sampling. Research without sampling is simply impossible, because researchers need to be able to select from a target group for the purposes of studying that which has been selected, and then generalize about the whole from what has been studied of the sample. So we're going to take a look at the whole issue of sampling. So what is sampling, and why do we sample? Now, sampling is a process of selecting units, for example, people, organization, etc., from a population of interest, so that by studying the sample, we may fairly generalize our results back to the population from which they were chosen. Let's begin by covering some of the key terms used in sampling, like population and sampling frame. Because some types of sampling rely upon quantitative models, we will also talk about some of the statistical terms used in sampling. Now, as with anything else in life, you have to learn the language of an area if you are going to ever hope to use it. Here, I want to introduce several different terms for the major groups that are involved in a sampling process, the role that each group plays in the logic of sampling. The major question that motivates us to sample in the first place is, who do you want to generalize to? Or should it be, to whom do you want to generalize? In most social research, we are interested in more than just the people who directly participate in our study. We would like to be able to talk in general terms and not be confined only to the people who are in our study. There are times when we aren't very concerned about generalizing. Maybe we are just evaluating a program in a local agency, and we don't care whether the program would work with other people in other places and other times. In that case, sampling and generalizing might not be of interest. In other cases, we would really like to be able to generalize almost universally. When psychologists do research, they are often interested in developing theories that will hold for all humans. But in most applied social research, we are interested in generalizing to specific groups. The group you wish to generalize to is often called the population in your study. This is the group you would like to sample from, because that is the group you are interested in generalizing to. Let's imagine that you wish to generalize to urban homeless males between the ages of 30 and 50 in the United States. If that is the population of interest, you are likely to have a very hard time developing a reasonable sampling plan. You are probably not going to find an accurate listing of this population. And even if you did, you will almost certainly not be able to mount a national sample across hundreds of urban areas. So we would probably make a distinction between the population you would like to generalize to and the population that will be accessible to you. We'll call the former the theoretical population and the latter the accessible population. In this example, the accessible population might be male beggars between the ages of 30 and 50 in 6 selected urban areas, let's say across Ghana. Once you've identified the theoretical and accessible population, you have to do one more thing before you can actually draw a sample. You have to get a list of the members of the accessible population, or you have to spell out in detail how you would contact them to assure representativeness. The listing of the accessible population from which you will draw your sample is called the sampling frame. If you were doing a phone survey and selecting names from the telephone book, the book will be your sampling frame. If you were doing a sample of some, let's say 100 students from the University of Ghana campus, main campus, your sampling frame, we say, would be the list of all University of Ghana students in the main campus, which you could obtain from the registry. That would not be a great way to sample, because significant sub-portions of the population, let's say, of beggars in Ghana, either don't have a phone or have moved in or out of the area, let's say Accra, since the last book was printed. Notice that in this case, you might identify the area code and all 3-digit prefixes within that area code and draw a sample simply by randomly dialing numbers, cleverly known as random digit dialing. In this case, the sampling frame is not a list per se, but is rather a procedure that you follow as the actual basis for sampling. In a case, if you were doing your research about the views of students from the University of Ghana main campus, then the complete listing of students you obtain from the academic registry would be the basis for which you would sample, and it will be your sampling frame. Finally, you actually draw your sample, that is using one of the many sampling procedures. The sample is a group of people who you select to be in your study. Notice that I didn't say that the sample was a group of people who are actually in your sample. You may not be able to contact or recruit all of the people you actually sample, or some could drop out over the course of the study. The group that actually completes your study is a subsample of the sample. It doesn't include non-respondents or dropouts. At this point, you should appreciate that sampling is a difficult multi-step process, and that there are lots of places you can go wrong. In fact, as we move from each step to the next in identifying a sample, there is the possibility of introducing what we call systematic error or bias into your study. For instance, even if you are able to identify perfectly the population of interest, you may not have access to all of them. And even if you do, you may not have a complete and accurate enumeration or sampling frame from which to select. For example, if you collected the list from the registry, the academic registry, chances are that the list might contain students who registered here and left to another university, or it may include students who have died, but their names have not been removed from the register. And even if you do, you may not draw the sample correctly or accurately. And even if you do, they may not all come and they may not all stay. Depressed yet, this is a very difficult business indeed. At times like this, I'm reminded of what Donald Campbell used to say. I'll paraphrase here. Cousins to the amoeba, it's amazing what we know, anything at all. Now let's begin by defining some very important simple terms that are relevant here. First, let's look at the results of your sampling efforts. When we sample, the units that we sample, usually people, supply us with one or more responses. In this sense, a response is a specific measurement value that a sampling unit supplies. In this figure, the person is responding to a survey instrument and gives a response of 4. When we look across the responses that we get for our entire sample, we use what we call a statistic. There are a wide variety of statistics we can use: the mean, median, mode, and so on. In this example, we see that the mean or average for the sample is, for example, 3.75. But the reason we sample it is such that we might get an estimate for the population we sampled from. If we could, we would much prefer to measure the entire population. If you measure the entire population and calculate a value like a mean or average, we don't refer to this as a statistic. We call it a parameter of the population. In other words, if you work out the average age of all University of Ghana students, we call that measurement, or that average age, which has been measured from the population, as a parameter. But if you take that measurement from the sample, we call it a sample statistic.